My claws cracked against the command console as the alarm screamed through the observation deck. Red lights painted the walls in pulses that matched the panic in my chest. I am Vesh Karnath, third-rank scholar of the Vorthaki Dominion, and in this moment I knew with terrible certainty that I had been wrong about everything. 200 years. 200 years I had watched these creatures from the shadow of their own moon. 200 years I had filed reports calling them weak, broken, afraid of their own shadows. And now the human ships were rising from their hidden bays beneath the ocean floor, and my hands would not stop shaking. The voice of War Prime Kazalter boomed through every speaker on our vessel. He was demanding answers. He was demanding to know how a species we had labeled as harmless was now showing teeth that could tear our fleet apart. I did not have an answer for him. I had only a memory, sharp and recent, of a human woman with gray hair and tired eyes looking into a camera and asking us a single question. "Are you certain?" That question had haunted me for 3 rotations now. I had dismissed it. We had all dismissed it. The fleet had laughed when the translation matrix relayed the words. Kazalter himself had snorted through his breathing slits and called it the bleating of a frightened animal. But the woman had not looked frightened. She had looked sad. She had looked like a parent watching a child reach for a flame after being warned 100 times. I pulled up the file I had been keeping in secret. The file I had never sent to the Dominion archives because I knew what would happen if I did. I would be stripped of rank. I would be called a fool. I would be reassigned to dust collection on some forgotten outer rim moon. So I had kept it hidden, my growing suspicion that the humans were not what we believed them to be. The file was full of strange things. Songs they sang at the graves of their fallen. Stones they carved with the names of those lost to old conflicts. Books written by their own warriors, books that screamed in ink about how terrible the act of war was. Films made by humans about humans where the heroes wept and the villains were also human, and every story ended with the same dark warning. Never again, never again, never again. We had read these things, we had watched these films, and we had concluded foolishly that these were the artifacts of a beaten people. A species so traumatized by its own past that it could no longer raise a hand in anger. We were wrong. We were so very wrong. Now I understood. The chants of never again were not the cries of cowards. They were the iron chains a giant had placed on its own wrists. Every memorial, every treaty, every documentary about the horrors of their old conflicts, these were not signs of weakness. They were the careful labels on a sealed box, warnings written in their own blood, telling future generations what waited inside if they ever opened it. And we had opened it. I rushed to the main viewing chamber, where Kazalter stood with his arms folded across his armored chest. He was looking down at the blue and green sphere below us with the patient hunger of a predator about to feed. He did not look at me when I entered. He never did. I bowed my head and spoke quickly. I told him what I had been discovering. I told him about the patterns in human history. I told him about the weapons they had built and then buried, the technologies they had developed and then hidden, the agreements they had signed with each other not to use the terrible things they had created. I told him that humans were not a species afraid of war. They were a species afraid of themselves. He turned his great head toward me slowly. His 3 eyes narrowed. He asked me if I was suggesting that the Vorthaki Dominion, which had brought 4,000 worlds into its fold through patient and measured conquest, should fear a single blue planet of soft-bodied primates. I told him yes. He laughed. The sound was loud and ugly. The other officers on the deck joined him because they had to. I stood there with my crest flattened against my skull and felt the heat of shame rising through my scales. Kazalter walked to the great window and pressed one armored hand against the glass. The planet turned beneath us, peaceful and bright. He said the words I will never forget. He said, "Look at them, Karnath. Look at how small they are. Look at how soft. They have begged their own gods for peace for 10,000 of their years. They will beg us too, and then they will kneel." I wanted to scream at him. I wanted to grab him by his great horned crown and shake him until his teeth rattled. But I was only a scholar, a third-rank scholar at that. So I bowed and I returned to my chamber and I began to record what I am recording now. For the past 3 days, I have been watching the human transmissions. Their leaders have not panicked. Their people have not fled. Their cities have not emptied. There has been a stillness on the planet that I have never seen before. It is the stillness of a body holding its breath. It is the stillness of a hand reaching for a weapon it had hoped to never touch again. The human governments have been speaking to each other, not in panic, but in coordination. Old enemies have set aside their old grudges. Nations that had not spoken in decades have opened channels in hours. Something is happening down there that I cannot fully see, and it terrifies me more than any open declaration of war ever could. I sent another report to Cazelter this morning. I begged him to delay the formal ultimatum. I told him we needed more time to study, more time to understand. I told him that the calculations my team had been running showed something impossible. The weapons capacity of this single species, when measured against their population and resources, exceeded what any logical model said they should possess. They had built more than they needed, far more. They had built enough to break their own world many times over. Why would a species afraid of war build such things? The answer came to me in the quiet of my chamber, with the lights dimmed and only the soft hum of the ship for company. They had not built these things because they were afraid. They had built them because they were not afraid enough. Because somewhere in their long and bloody history, they had learned that the only thing that kept their own kind from tearing each other apart was the certainty of total ruin. They had built a wall of fear around themselves, and they had taught themselves to be terrified of what they could do. That was the secret. That was the thing we had missed. The humans were not pacified. They were paroled. They were not gentle. They were restrained. And the restraint was something they had placed upon themselves, voluntarily, generation after generation, because the alternative was something so terrible that they could not allow it to happen again. Cazelter did not respond to my report. Instead, he summoned the entire observation team to the bridge. He told us that the time for study was over. The fleet would arrive in 12 hours. The ultimatum would be delivered. The humans would either kneel or be reminded of their place. He looked at me when he said this last part, and his 3 eyes held nothing but contempt. I returned to my chamber and I tried to sleep. I could not. I lay on my resting platform and I stared at the ceiling, and I thought about the woman with the tired eyes who had asked us if we were certain. I thought about the songs at the gravesides and the stones with the names. I thought about every human child I had ever observed, being taught by parents and teachers and priests to fear the very thing their species had made. We had mistaken a warning for a weakness. We had read a sign that said danger and assumed it meant defeat. I am writing this now from my chamber as the fleet prepares for the final approach. In a few hours, we will appear above their world in formation, 340 ships strong. Cazelter will deliver the ultimatum. He will demand their surrender. He will expect tears and trembling and the slow opening of their borders to our administrators. I do not think that is what we will receive. I think we will receive silence first. A long, terrible silence as they confirm what we are, as they verify that we are real, as they look upon us from their hidden places and make a decision they have spent 100 years praying they would never have to make. Then I think they will answer us with that question, the same question the woman with the tired eyes asked, the question I cannot stop hearing in my dreams. Are you certain? And Cazelter, in his pride and his certainty and his absolute confidence in our superiority, will say yes. He will mean it. He will believe it. And in that moment, he will not understand what he has done. He will not understand that he has just given the humans permission to stop being what they have spent 100 years pretending to be. He will not understand that he has just told the giant it is allowed to take off the chains. I am only a scholar. I have no command authority. I cannot order the fleet to turn back. I cannot stop Kazalter from speaking the words. I can only watch and record and pray to ancestors who have never answered me before. I look out my chamber window now. The earth fills my view, blue and white and impossibly beautiful. There are 8 billion of them down there. 8 billion creatures who have, every single day for generations, woken up and chosen not to destroy themselves. 8 billion creatures who have looked at the weapons they built and the powers they discovered and said, "Not today, not today, not today." We are about to give them a reason to say today. My hands are still shaking. My crest is flat against my skull. There is a coldness in my belly that I have never felt before in 200 years of service. It is not the coldness of fear. It is the coldness of grief. The grief of someone who knows what is coming and cannot stop it. In 12 hours, the ships will move into position. In 12 hours, Kazalter will speak. In 12 hours, the humans will answer. I do not know what their answer will be, but I know, deep in the part of myself that has watched them for 2 centuries, that we are not going to like it. I know that the woman with the tired eyes was not asking us a question. She was offering us a chance to turn back, a chance to leave, a chance to be the only species in the galaxy that had ever looked upon Earth and decided to walk away. We are not going to take that chance. Kazalter will see to that. His pride will not allow it. The Dominion will not allow it. We have integrated 4,000 worlds. What is one more? What is one more, I keep asking myself. What is one more? The alarm is sounding again. The fleet is moving into final position. I must put down this record and report to my station. I do not know if I will have another chance to write. I do not know if any of us will survive what comes next. But if you find this record, whoever you are, in whatever distant time and place, know this. We were warned. We were warned by every monument, by every song, by every tired and grieving human face that ever looked into a camera and asked us to think before we acted. We did not think. And now the giant is waking up. The ultimatum went out at the start of the 8th rotation. Kazalter sat upon his command throne with his arms spread wide, his ceremonial robes hanging in heavy folds around his bulk. The broadcast filled every channel on Earth, every screen, every speaker, every device that could carry sound or image. There was no escape from his voice. He had designed it that way. He demanded that the humans surrender their sovereignty. He demanded that they accept Vorthaki rule. He demanded that they open their borders, hand over their leaders, dismantle their militaries, and prepare for integration into the Dominion. He gave them 73 of their minutes to comply. He told them that resistance would result in measured correction. He used that phrase, measured correction, as if he were a teacher disciplining a misbehaving student. Then he ended the transmission and leaned back in his throne and waited. I stood at my station in the observation bay, watching the readouts. My fingers hovered over the console without touching it. I was waiting too. We were all waiting. The bridge was silent except for the soft electronic hum of the ship and the slow, rhythmic breathing of the senior officers. The first thing that happened was nothing. The full 73 minutes passed. No response came from Earth. No transmission. No movement of military assets. No emergency broadcasts to their people. Nothing. Kazalter began to smile. I could see it in the corner of his great mouth, the slow curl of satisfaction. He believed they were frozen. He believed they were paralyzed with fear. He turned to his second in command and ordered the demonstration to begin. A small uninhabited island in their southern ocean. A warning shot, he called it, just enough to remind them of what we could do. The strike vessel launched. The weapon detonated. The island vanished into a column of steam and debris that rose into the upper atmosphere of the planet. The image was beautiful in its terrible way. Kazalter watched it with the pleasure of a craftsman admiring his own work. And then the humans answered. The transmission came in not from one source but from 9 separate channels, broadcasting from 9 different locations across the planet. Each channel carried a different voice. Each voice spoke a different language, but the message, when the translation matrix processed it, was the same in every case. Are you certain? That was the entire transmission. 3 words repeated 9 times in 9 different tongues from 9 different places. There was no threat. There was no plea. There was no negotiation, just the question. Kazalter laughed. He told the bridge crew that the humans were stalling. He ordered the second demonstration. He selected a coastal city this time, one of the smaller ones, a place we had identified as having minimal military value. He said we would give them a real reason to come to the table. I could not stop myself. I stepped forward from my station. I called out his name. I begged him to wait. I told him that the question they were asking was important. I told him that they were giving us a chance to leave. I told him that if we struck that city, we would not be able to take it back. Kazalter turned his great head toward me very slowly. The bridge crew went still. The silence was so complete I could hear my own heart drumming against my ribs. He asked me, in a voice as soft as snow falling, if I was attempting to override the command of a war prime. I bowed my head. I said no. I said I was only offering counsel. He told me that my counsel was not requested. He told me that if I spoke again without being addressed, I would be confined to my quarters for the duration of the campaign. He told me that scholars did not understand war, and that this was why scholars were not given command. I returned to my station. I put my hands on the console. I did not look up. The second strike was ordered. The weapon launched. 12 million human lives ended in the span of a single one of their seconds. The city had been called Lagos. I made myself learn the name. I made myself record it. I would not let it be a statistic. I would not let it be a number on a report. The transmission from Earth came back within minutes. This time it was different. This time it was a single voice. A woman. The same woman I realized with a jolt who had spoken to us before. The one with gray hair and tired eyes. The one who had asked us if we were certain. She did not look tired anymore. She did not look sad anymore. Her eyes had changed. They were dry and steady, and they had something in them that I had never seen in a human face before. It was not anger. It was not hatred. It was something colder than either of those things. It was the look of someone who had just signed a document she had spent her whole life trying not to sign. She spoke very slowly. She said that for the past 120 years, her species had been preparing for 2 possibilities. The first was that they would survive their own dark impulses and become something better. The second was that they would not. She said that the work of preparing for the first possibility had been hard. The work of preparing for the second possibility had been harder. But they had done both, because they were a species that took its responsibilities seriously, and they knew that the universe might one day demand answers from them. She said that until today, they had hoped the second preparation would never be needed. She said that until today, they had believed that their long fear of war had been the right path, the only path, the path that would save them and the path that might one day save others. She said that they had been wrong about one thing. They had been wrong to assume that the universe shared their fear. She paused for a long moment. She looked directly into the camera. She looked, somehow, directly at me. She said, "We asked you twice if you were certain. We did not ask you because we wanted you to surrender. We asked you because we wanted to be sure of what you were. Now we are sure." The transmission ended. The bridge was completely silent. Even Kazalter had stopped breathing for a moment. He recovered quickly, of course. He waved one great hand and dismissed the broadcast as more theatrics. He ordered the fleet to prepare for the next phase of the operation. He ordered the deployment of the ground forces. He moved on. But I could not move on. I returned to my chamber. I locked the door. I sat in the darkness and I shook. I had spent 200 years studying these creatures, and in that one short transmission, the woman had told me that I had still missed the most important thing about them. They were not afraid of war because they were weak. They were afraid of war because they were strong. They had built their entire civilization on the foundation of that fear, and we had just told them in front of their own people that their fear was a joke to us. We had told the giant that the chains were not real. I pulled up my secret file again. I added new entries. I documented the question. I documented the demonstration of Lagos. I documented the woman's final words. I added one more entry at the bottom, my own observation, my own conclusion. I wrote, "They have decided." I did not yet know what they had decided. I did not yet know how, but I knew that something had shifted, somewhere down on that blue and green world, in the minds of the people who held the keys to weapons we had not yet identified. I knew that the long hesitation was over. I knew that the careful generations of restraint had just been spent in a single afternoon, and that what came next would be the work of those who had spent their lives waiting for orders they had prayed would never come. The fleet continued its operations. Kazalter ordered the deployment of orbital scanning arrays to identify human military assets for the next phase. The scans began. The data started to come in, and almost immediately, the technical officers began to make sounds I had never heard them make before, sounds of confusion, sounds of disbelief. I forced myself to leave my chamber and return to the bridge. I needed to see this for myself. Screens were filling with red icons, military installations, weapons platforms, strategic reserves, but the icons were not where they should have been. They were not concentrated around military bases. They were not gathered near government centers. They were everywhere. They were in the oceans. They were in the mountains. They were beneath cities. They were in places that the humans had spent decades pretending were research stations, civilian outposts, communications relays, weather monitoring centers. Every satellite they had launched in the past 40 of their years had been a weapon in disguise. Every deep ocean facility had been an arsenal. Every research station in their polar regions had been a launching platform. They had hidden their teeth inside their tools, their fangs inside their gardens, their fists inside their open hands. The technical chief looked up from his console with an expression I will remember until the day I die. He said, in a voice that did not sound like his own, that we were currently surrounded by more weapons platforms than the Vorthaki Dominion possessed in its entire fleet. Kazalter did not respond immediately. He stared at the screens. His 3 eyes moved slowly across the readouts. His armored chest rose and fell with deep, measured breaths. He told the chief that the readings must be wrong. He told the chief to recalibrate the scanners. He told the chief that no species of this developmental level could have produced what the screens were showing. The chief recalibrated. The readings did not change. If anything, more weapons platforms came into view as the scanners worked at higher resolutions. There were thousands. There were tens of thousands. There were objects buried so deep beneath the human cities that we had never seen them before, objects with energy signatures that suggested capabilities our own military had only theorized about. Kazalter stood up very slowly from his throne. He walked to the great viewing window. He pressed one armored hand against the glass and looked down at the planet, the peaceful blue and green sphere, the world he had called soft, the world he had called primitive, the world he had been planning to integrate into his dominion before lunch. He said nothing for a very long time. Then he turned to the bridge crew and he ordered the fleet to back away from the planet, not to retreat, not to flee, just to gain distance, to reassess, to recalculate. It was the first order he had given that did not contain absolute certainty. It was the first sign of doubt I had ever seen from him. It was too late. The proximity alarm sounded across the bridge, every screen filled with warnings. The technical chief shouted that something was moving toward us, something fast, something we had not detected before, something coming from one of the supposed civilian satellites in low orbit above the planet. The kinetic strike crossed the distance between Earth and our fleet flagship in less than 4 seconds. The Veiled Sovereign was an enormous vessel, built to be the pride of the Vorthaki military, armored against any threat we had ever imagined. It did not survive the impact. It was simply gone. One moment it was there, the largest ship in the formation, carrying our entire command structure. The next moment it was a cloud of glittering debris spreading across the void. 60,000 Vorthaki lives ended in the span of a single breath, including, I realized with a strange and distant calm, the War Prime Kazalter himself, who had been about to issue a new order from the command center of that very ship. The bridge of our observation vessel went silent. Then it erupted into chaos. Officers shouted. Alarms blared. Communications channels filled with the panicked voices of every captain in the fleet demanding orders, demanding direction, demanding to know what had just happened. I stood at my station and I did not move. I could not move. I was thinking about the woman with the tired eyes. I was thinking about her final words. We are sure of what you are. The humans had answered our question. They had answered it with the most elegant and terrible response possible. They had not declared war. They had simply removed the head of the snake that had come to bite them. One ship, one strike, one War Prime who would never again order the destruction of a city for the crime of asking us a question. I knew, with a certainty that filled my chest like ice water, that this was only the beginning. The fleet had no command structure. The chain of authority had been on the flagship. We were 340 ships of confused captains and frightened crews, suddenly leaderless, suddenly aware that the soft and frightened species below us had been neither soft nor frightened, but only patient. And patient creatures, I had learned over 2 centuries of study, were the most dangerous kind, because patient creatures did not strike when they were angry. They struck when they were ready. The humans were ready. I sat down at my console. I opened a new file. I began to record, because someone needed to be a witness. Someone needed to remember. Someone needed to tell the rest of the Dominion, if any of us survived to tell it, what was about to happen. The giant had taken off the chains, and it was looking up. The new transmission came through every channel of every surviving Vorthaki ship at exactly the same moment. It was not directed at any single vessel. It was broadcast openly in our own language, in every dialect we had ever used in this region of space. The humans had been listening to us for far longer than we had imagined. They had learned our tongues. They had been waiting, patient as winter, for the day they might need to speak to us. The voice this time was not the woman with the tired eyes. It was a male voice, deep and steady, speaking with the calm authority of someone who had practiced these words many times. He introduced himself as a representative of all human nations, speaking with a single voice for the first time in their long history. He said his name was Walter Heyman. He said he would not say it again, because names did not matter in what came next. Only the message mattered. He spoke for 11 minutes. He spoke without anger. He spoke without joy. He spoke the way one might read a list of instructions to a child who could not yet read for themselves. He said that humanity had taken its action against the Vorthaki flagship not as a declaration of war, but as a closing of a question. We had asked, by our attack on Lagos, whether we were the kind of species that destroyed cities to make a point. They had answered by destroying our flagship, that they were the kind of species that would not allow such a question to be asked twice. He said that the fleet now had 2 choices. The first choice was to withdraw, to leave the Sol system within 12 of their hours, to return to Vorthaki space and never come back. If we chose this option, no further action would be taken against our vessels. We would be allowed to leave. We would be allowed to live. The second choice was to remain, to attempt to continue the operation, to believe, perhaps, that the loss of one ship was a fortunate accident and that our overall fleet superiority could still bring this conflict to the conclusion Kazalter had imagined. He paused after presenting the second choice. He let the silence stretch. Then he said that if we made the second choice, humanity would no longer be a species that hesitated. He said the careful restraint of generations had been a kindness offered to a universe that, until today, had not given them reason to set it aside. He said that they had now been given reason. He said that the next phase, if it came, would not be confined to defending their world. It would extend wherever it needed to extend. He said that they had spent 100 years preparing for the possibility that the universe might force their hand, and that the preparations had been thorough. He ended his transmission with a sentence I will carry until I die. He said, "We hope to never become what you have just made us. We are sorry that you chose this path. Choose better in the next 12 hours or do not choose at all." The transmission ended. The fleet was silent. 339 ships floated in the void above Earth, captains looking at each other through their communications channels, no one knowing what to say. The command structure was gone. The war prime was gone. There was no one to make the decision that needed to be made. I sat at my station and watched the timer begin its count. 12 hours, 12 human hours, less than half a rotation for us. The captains began to argue across the channels. Some demanded retreat. Some demanded counterattack. Some demanded that we contact the Dominion High Command and request immediate reinforcement. The arguments grew loud and bitter. Old rivalries surfaced. Old debts were named. The fleet that had arrived as a unified force began to fracture in the space of an hour. The captain of our own vessel, a senior officer named Threshold, finally cut through the noise. He demanded order. He demanded silence. He said that as the senior officer of the highest remaining rank, he was taking temporary command of the fleet until proper authority could be established. The other captains accepted this, mostly because no one else wanted the burden. Threshold opened a private channel to me and asked me to come to his ready room. I went. My legs felt heavy. My mouth was dry. I knew what he wanted from me. I knew what I had to tell him. When I entered, he was standing at the window with his back to me. He did not turn around. He asked me in a quiet voice what I thought we should do. I told him the truth. I told him that we should leave. I told him that the humans had given us a real offer, and that no matter how it felt to our pride, accepting it was the only choice that ended with any of us going home. I told him that if we tried to fight, we would not be fighting the humans we had imagined. We would be fighting the humans they had become in the past 4 hours. He turned around. His 3 eyes were heavy. He told me that he agreed with me. He told me that his own analysis had reached the same conclusion. He told me that he had already drafted the withdrawal order. But he could not give it. He explained why. The Dominion had laws that went back 10,000 years. A war prime had been struck down by an enemy. The honor of the Dominion required a response. If Threshold ordered withdrawal without consulting the High Command, he would be executed when he returned home. His family would be stripped of rank. His name would be removed from the records. If he ordered the fleet to remain and fight and we lost, he would die in the fighting. But his name would survive. His family would be honored. His sacrifice would be remembered. He was choosing his own death and the destruction of the fleet, because the rules of the Dominion gave him no other choice. I begged him with every ounce of breath I had. I told him that the rules of the Dominion had been written for wars against species we could understand. They had not been written for this. I told him that no one would judge him for breaking a rule that had not anticipated the situation he was in. I told him that he had a duty to the thousands of crew on these ships, not just to the abstract honor of a system that could not see what was happening. He listened. He did not interrupt. He let me speak my piece. Then he told me, in the gentlest voice I had ever heard him use, that he understood, that he agreed, that if he were free to choose only on the basis of what was best for the crews under his command, he would order withdrawal in a heartbeat, but that he was not free. None of us were. We were the products of a Dominion that had built itself on certain principles, and one of those principles was that we did not run from inferior species. I told him that they were not inferior. He smiled just slightly with the corner of his mouth. He said, "You are the only one in this fleet who knew that before today. The rest of us are just learning, and we do not have time to learn enough to act on what we now know." He dismissed me. I returned to my station. I watched the clock count down. 6 hours remained. Then 4. Then 2. In the final hour, Threshold sent a message to the Dominion High Command. He requested guidance. He laid out the situation. He included a recommendation, very carefully worded, that the fleet be authorized to withdraw for tactical reasons, and that a full diplomatic mission be sent to engage with the humans on equal terms. The response came back faster than it should have. The High Command had clearly already been monitoring the situation. The order was simple and short. The fleet was to remain in position. The fleet was to defend the honor of the fallen War Prime. The fleet was to bring the humans to their knees, or to die in the attempt. Threshold received the order. He read it. He looked at it for a long time. Then he stood up and put on his ceremonial armor and went to the bridge. I followed him. I do not know why. There was nothing I could do. There was nothing anyone could do, but I needed to see it. I needed to be a witness. I needed to remember. The 12-hour mark passed. The humans did not transmit. They did not need to. The answer had been given by our silence. Threshold ordered the fleet to prepare for attack. The captains acknowledged the order. The ships began to move into combat formation. Weapons charged. Shields rose. The fleet that had come to integrate a soft world now braced itself for the worst conflict in Vorthaki history. It lasted less than 70 of their minutes. The humans did not attack with what we had expected. They did not send fleets of warships. They did not engage in combat as we understood it. They simply began to remove our weapons. The first thing I noticed was that our offensive systems had stopped responding, not all at once, one by one. A weapons platform on a forward ship would suddenly report a system failure, then another, then another. The pattern spread through the fleet like a slow tide. By the time the technical officers realized what was happening, every offensive system on every ship had been compromised. The weapons were not destroyed. They were not damaged. They were simply turned off, somehow, from a distance, by something we could not see. I learned later, much later, that the humans had deployed what they called nanite swarms, tiny machines, smaller than dust, that drifted through the void and entered our ships through every microscopic gap in our hulls. The machines did not damage us. They did not harm a single crew member. They only disabled the weapons. They were programmed to recognize military hardware and to render it inert. They were programmed to leave everything else alone. Within an hour, the great Vorthaki fleet was a collection of unarmed vessels floating in space. We could still move. We could still maneuver. We could still go home, but we could not fight. Threshold sat on the command throne with his hands flat on the armrests. He stared at the readouts. The technical chief reported, in a voice that broke twice while speaking, that we had no offensive capability remaining. None. Across the entire fleet. The new transmission came through. The male voice again, Walter Heyman, said, "We offered you a choice. You chose to remain. We will not destroy your fleet. We will not harm your crews, but your weapons are no longer yours. Your ability to make war on others is no longer yours. You may return to your home. You will arrive unarmed. You will explain to your government what has happened here, and you will tell them that any further movement of Vorthaki military forces toward Earth, or toward any world that wishes to be free of Vorthaki rule, will be met with the same response." He paused. He said, "We are not your conquerors. We do not want your worlds. We do not want your wealth. We do not want your culture or your history or your future. We only want you to leave us alone. And we want you to leave alone everyone else who, until today, did not know that being left alone was something they could ask for." He paused again. He said, "The age of the Vorthaki Dominion is ending, not because we are ending it, because you ended it the moment you destroyed a city to answer a question. We are simply making sure that what you started cannot be continued." The transmission ended. Threshold rose from his throne. He walked to the great window. He looked down at the planet the same way Kazalter had done before him, but with a very different expression. There was no hunger in his 3 eyes. There was no contempt. There was only a quiet and bottomless grief. He gave the order to depart. The fleet turned. The engines lit. We began the long, slow journey home, 339 unarmed ships limping back to a dominion that did not yet know what had happened to it. I returned to my chamber. I opened my secret file. I wrote a single new entry. I wrote, "They did not kill us. That is the part I cannot yet understand. They had us. They could have ended every life in this fleet with the same effort it took to disable our weapons. They chose not to. They chose mercy. After everything we did, after Lagos, after the demonstration, after the ultimatum and the refusal of their offer, they chose mercy." I sat in the dark for a long time thinking about that. About what kind of species, after being attacked and provoked and pushed past every reasonable limit, would still hold itself back from the easy answer. About what kind of restraint that required. About what kind of strength it took to win and then choose not to take more than winning required. I had spent 2 centuries calling them weak. I had been wrong about so many things, but that, I realized, was the thing I had been most wrong about, the thing I would spend the rest of my life trying to understand. A few hours into the journey home, my console chimed. A private transmission. I checked the source. It was from Earth. It was addressed to me, to Vesh Karnoth, 3rd-rank scholar of the Vorthaki Dominion, by name. I opened it with shaking hands. It was a message from a human, a scientist, a woman named Yuki Tanaka. She introduced herself politely. She said that humanity had been monitoring our internal communications for many years. She said that they had read every report I had ever filed. She said that they had noticed, over the past 2 centuries, that there was one scholar among the Vorthaki who had consistently expressed doubts, one scholar who had warned his superiors, one scholar who had been ignored. She said that humanity had a question for me. She said that they were not yet ready to engage diplomatically with the Vorthaki Dominion. They wanted to understand us first. They wanted to know what kind of species we were, beyond what they had seen of our military. She said that they were inviting me to come to Earth, not as a prisoner, not as a captive, as a guest, as a scholar, as someone who might help them understand the people who had just come to take their world. She said the decision was mine. She said there would be no consequence if I refused. The fleet would continue home, and I would continue with it, and nothing more would be said. But the offer was there. I sat with the message for a long time. I thought about my home. I thought about my family. I thought about the Dominion and the certain punishment that would await me if I were to abandon my post. I thought about Threshold, who would be executed when we arrived home, and the thousands of others who would share various fates. I thought about Lagos and about 12 million lives that no Vorthaki action could ever repay. I sent my response. I said yes. A small human vessel intercepted our fleet 2 hours later. Threshold did not ask questions when the vessel matched our speed and requested the transfer of 1 passenger. He simply confirmed the request and authorized the transfer. As I stepped into the airlock to leave the only home I had ever known, I caught one last look at him. He gave me a small nod. There was, perhaps, a faint smile at the corner of his mouth. He had wanted, I think, to be the one to leave. He had wanted, I think, to escape what was waiting for him at home, but he could not. The rules would not allow it. I could. I crossed into the human vessel. The airlock sealed behind me. For the first time in my life, I was no longer Vorthaki. I was something new. I did not yet have a word for it, but the humans, I suspected, would help me find one. The human vessel was smaller than I had expected. The interior smelled strange to me, like metal and recycled air and something faintly green, as if they had been growing plants somewhere on board. I was greeted at the airlock by 2 humans. One was Yuki Tanaka, the woman who had sent me the message. The other was a man with white hair and a face full of soft lines that I would later learn were called wrinkles, the marks of a long life lived through difficult years. He introduced himself as Edward Bram. He was a scientist, too, of a different kind. He studied minds. He studied what made species do what they did. They did not bow to me. They did not threaten me. They did not treat me as a prisoner or a curiosity. They treated me from the very first moment as a colleague. Yuki shook my four-fingered hand carefully, the way one might handle a delicate instrument. Edward simply nodded and gestured for me to follow them deeper into the ship. They brought me to a small chamber that had been prepared for my comfort. The lights were dimmed to a level my eyes could tolerate. The temperature was adjusted slightly cooler than the rest of the ship, closer to the conditions of my home world. There was a chair sized for my body, with an opening at the back to accommodate my dorsal ridge. They had done their research. They had been preparing for me for some time, perhaps longer than they had let on. They sat across from me. Yuki offered me water, which I accepted. The water tasted clean and bright on my tongue. I had not realized how thirsty I had been. They did not begin with questions. They began by telling me things about themselves, things about their people, things about what had happened over the past several days from their perspective. They wanted me to understand the choices they had made and why they had made them. They wanted, Edward said with a small, sad smile, for me to know that they had not enjoyed any of it. He told me that the decision to disable our flagship had been made by a council that had not slept in 3 days. He told me that the council had voted, and that the vote had been close. Many had argued for a different response. Some had wanted to attempt further negotiation, even after Lagos. Some had wanted to demonstrate human capability without destroying any Vorthaki lives. But the majority had concluded that allowing Kazalter to continue would have resulted in further attacks on human cities, and that the only way to stop him was to remove him. He told me that the council had wept after the vote, that the woman with the tired eyes, whose name was Lillian Court, had been the one to deliver the order, and that she had asked to be alone after she had done so. He told me that across the entire planet in the hours after the flagship was destroyed, there had been no celebrations, no parties, no cheering, only silence. The silence of a species that had just done something it had hoped never to do. I listened. I did not speak. I did not know what to say. Yuki took over. She told me about Lagos. She told me about the 12 million who had died. She told me that the human governments had been overwhelmed with the recovery effort, that they had not stopped working since the moment the city had been struck, that they were doing everything possible to help the survivors and to honor the lost. She told me that there were memorials being built already, not just in Lagos itself, but in every city on Earth. She told me that the name of every human who had died in those 18 seconds had been recorded, and that the recording would be read aloud, one name at a time, in a ceremony that would last for many days. She paused. She looked at me very directly. She said, "We are also building a memorial for the 60,000 Vorthaki who died on the flagship." I do not know what sound I made. It was not a word. It was something between a gasp and a small, involuntary cry. The idea was so foreign to me that my mind refused to process it for a moment. They were building a memorial for the soldiers who had come to take their world, for the crew of the ship that had destroyed Lagos. They were honoring our dead. I asked her why. She said because they were people, because every life is a life, because when we mourn only our own, we forget what we are. Because if we let ourselves stop mourning the people we have lost, even the people who hurt us, then we have already become what we are trying not to be. I sat in that small chamber and I felt tears come to my eyes. I had not cried since I was a hatchling. The Vorthaki do not cry as adults. We are trained out of it, but I cried then. I cried for a long time. Yuki and Edward did not speak. They did not move. They simply let me have the moment. When I was finished, Edward leaned forward in his chair. He said, "We need your help." I asked them what they could possibly need from me. He told me that the next phase was the hardest one. The fleet was returning to Vorthaki space. The Dominion would learn what had happened. The High Command would have to decide what to do next. There was a real possibility that they would order another military response, a larger one, with the full resources of the Dominion behind it. There was a real possibility that the humans would be forced to defend themselves again, on a much larger scale. Humanity did not want that. They had not wanted the first conflict, and they did not want a second one. They wanted, if it was at all possible, to find a way to talk to the Dominion, to make the Dominion understand what had happened, and why, and what would happen if they tried again. For that, they needed someone who could speak to both sides, someone who knew Vorthaki culture from the inside, someone whose name and rank would be recognized, who could carry a message with weight, someone who could explain to the High Command what they could not explain to themselves. They knighted me. I told them I was a third-rank scholar. I told them that no one in the High Command would listen to a third-rank scholar, especially one who had abandoned his post. Yuki smiled. She said, "You are not a third-rank scholar anymore. You are the only Vorthaki who has been to Earth. You are the only Vorthaki who has spoken with humanity face to face. You are the only Vorthaki who knows what we are and what we are not and what we will do if forced. When you return to Vorthak Prime, you will not be a third-rank scholar. You will be the most important voice in the Dominion, and we will make sure of that." I asked her how. She said, "Because we will go with you." I stared at her. She said that a small human delegation would accompany me to Vorthak Prime, not to negotiate, not to threaten, to explain, to present evidence, to answer questions, to stand before the High Command and let them see with their own eyes what kind of species humanity was. The delegation would include her. It would include Edward. It would include a small number of others who had been chosen for their ability to communicate across difference, to speak truth without anger, to represent humanity at its best. I asked her if she understood what she was offering. I told her that the High Command might not let them leave, that they might be taken as captives, that the Dominion was not bound by the rules of diplomatic protection that the humans had observed. She said, "We know. We have prepared for that possibility." I asked her how. She told me. I will not record the details here because they were never meant to be shared, but she told me enough to understand that the delegation would not be defenseless, that humanity had not arrived at this stage of their development by being naive about the species they would eventually meet, that every member of the delegation carried with them, in ways I could not see, protections that would make any attempt to detain them very, very costly to whoever tried. I sat with all of this for a long time. The two humans waited patiently. They did not press me. They simply gave me the space I needed. Finally, I asked them why they trusted me. They had no real reason to. I had been part of the fleet that had come to take their world. I had stood by while Kazalter had given the order to destroy Lagos. I had not spoken out in time. I had not warned them, even though my long study had given me enough understanding to know what was coming. Edward answered. He said, "We trust you because you doubted, because for 200 years you wrote reports that your superiors did not want to read, because you saw something they refused to see and you kept seeing it even though seeing it gained you nothing. Because when the moment came and we offered you a way to do something good, you did not hesitate. You did not bargain. You said yes." He said, "We have known your kind a long time, from a distance. We know what you value and what you fear and what your culture rewards. Doubt is not rewarded among the Vorthaki. Curiosity about the wrong things is not rewarded. The fact that you kept being curious, even when it cost you, told us everything we needed to know about you." He said, "You are a good person, Vesh Karnath. We are sorry that the universe did not give you better company." I cried again then. I did not try to hide it. We spent the next several days preparing. The human vessel was equipped with communication systems that I had not imagined could exist. I was given access to information that the humans had been gathering for over a century. I learned things about my own species that no Vorthaki had ever been told. I learned about patterns in our history, about the way the Dominion had risen, about the species we had integrated and the costs of that integration, about the lies our own historians had told us to make our conquests seem noble. It was not easy. There were moments when I wanted to deny what I was seeing. There were moments when I wanted to defend my people, my culture, my home. But Yuki and Edward were patient. They did not lecture me. They did not gloat. They simply presented what they had found and let me decide what to do with it. By the time we arrived at the edge of Vorthaki space, I was a different person than the one who had stepped into the airlock. I was still Vesh Karnoth. I was still Vorthaki, but I was something more now. Something that had its eyes open. Something that could see in two directions at once. The fleet had arrived home before us. The High Command had received Threshol's report. Threshold himself had been arrested upon docking. The news had spread through the Dominion within hours. The defeat, the disgrace, the loss of the flagship and the War Prime, the order from the unknown humans that we were never to return. The High Command had not yet decided how to respond. There was furious debate. There were factions calling for immediate retaliation. There were others, smaller but growing, who argued for caution. The Dominion was in a state I had never seen before. It was uncertain. It was afraid. Into that uncertainty, we arrived. The human vessel made its presence known at the boundary of Vorthaki space. It transmitted its identification and its purpose. It requested permission to enter for diplomatic discussions. It included my own voice in the transmission, identifying me as a member of the delegation and asking, formally, for an audience with the High Command. There was a long silence. Hours passed. I could imagine the panic in the chambers of the High Command. They had not expected this. They had not prepared for it. A human ship at their door with one of their own scholars on board requesting to speak with them. It was outside every protocol. It was outside every precedent. Eventually, the response came. Permission was granted, with conditions. The human vessel would be escorted by a Vorthaki military convoy. The delegation would be received in the main council chamber. The discussions would be limited to 4 of their hours. After that, the delegation would be required to leave. We accepted the terms. The journey to Vorthak Prime took another 2 days. During that time, I prepared. Yuki and Edward and the rest of the delegation prepared. We rehearsed what would be said. We rehearsed how we would present the evidence. We rehearsed how to handle the worst possible reactions from the High Command. I introduced the human delegates to Vorthaki customs they would need to follow. I taught them how to greet a council member. I taught them which gestures were polite and which were grave insults. I taught them how to speak to power in a culture where power expected to be obeyed without question. The delegation listened. They learned. They were not too proud to accept that they were the foreigners here and that they would need to behave as guests. They did not demand that the Vorthaki accommodate them. They committed themselves to accommodating the Vorthaki, even as they prepared to deliver a message that would shake the foundations of the Dominion to its bones. When we arrived at Vorthak Prime, the planet looked different to me than it ever had before. I had been born here. I had grown up here. I had lived among its red stone cities and its purple gardens for the first 80 years of my life before I had been sent out as an observer. It had always been the center of the world, in my mind. It had always been the place all other places revolved around. Now I saw it as Yuki and Edward saw it. A planet, one among many, beautiful in its own way like all worlds, important to those who lived on it like all worlds, but not the center of anything except itself. We landed. We were escorted from the vessel by a phalanx of Vorthaki guards. The streets were lined with citizens, many of whom had never seen a human before and who stared at the delegation with a mixture of fear and fascination. There were no cheers. There were no jeers. There was only the long, silent watching of a population that did not yet know what to think. We were brought to the council chamber. The doors closed behind us. The High Command sat on the high benches in their ceremonial robes, 14 elders, each one the senior representative of one of the major Vorthaki houses. They looked down at us in silence. The eldest, Speaker Vrothan, finally rose and began the formal greeting. Yuki rose to respond. She had practiced this. She delivered the human delegation's introduction in fluent ceremonial Vorthaki with all the proper gestures and inflections. The council chamber went very still. I could feel the surprise of the 14 elders even from where I sat. They had not expected this. They had expected primitives. They had expected creatures who could barely communicate. They had expected weakness. Yuki finished her introduction. She bowed in the correct manner. She sat. Speaker Vrothan was silent for a long moment. Then he asked, in his own voice, what humanity wanted from the Vorthaki Dominion. Yuki rose again. She said, "We want nothing. We came here only to make sure that you understand what has happened and what will happen if you make the wrong choice in response. We came to give you information. The choice itself will be yours." She began to speak, and as she spoke, I realized that this was the moment my entire life had been pointing toward. 200 years of observation, 200 years of doubt, 200 years of being dismissed and ignored and laughed at. Now I was here, in the highest chamber of my own people, sitting beside humans who had trusted me with their lives, listening to the truth being spoken to the council that had ruled my world since before my hatching. And I knew, with a quiet certainty that filled my chest, that nothing would be the same after today. Not for the Vorthaki, not for the galaxy, not for me. Speaker Vrothan listened to Yuki Tanaka for almost an hour without interrupting her. She did not raise her voice. She did not threaten. She did not boast. She simply laid out the facts in the order she had prepared them: the arrival of the fleet, the ultimatum, the first demonstration on the uninhabited island, the destruction of Lagos, the response from Earth, the disabling of the fleet. The choice, she said, humanity had made to spare every Vorthaki life that could be spared. When she finished, the council chamber was silent. The 14 elders did not look at each other. They did not whisper to their aides. They sat very still and they stared at the small group of humans below them, and I could see in their faces something I had never seen in the faces of the high command before. It was not anger. It was not pride. It was confusion. The kind of confusion that comes when a creature you have always understood does something you cannot understand, and you suddenly realize that you have never understood the creature at all. Speaker Vrothan finally spoke. He asked Yuki why humanity had not destroyed the fleet. He said it in the way one might ask a strange question to a child, with patience but also with a deep underlying need to know. Yuki answered without hesitation. She said because the people on those ships had not made the decisions that brought them here. They were soldiers. They were crew. They were following orders. We do not believe in punishing those who follow orders for the choices of those who give them. We took the head that needed to be taken. We did not need the rest. Vrothan asked her why she had come here, knowing the danger, knowing that the high command might decide to detain her delegation, or worse. She said because we have hope, because we believe that the Vorthaki are not yet beyond reach, because we have watched your people for many years, and we have seen that not all of you are like the War Prime who came to our world. We have seen scholars who doubted. We have seen citizens who questioned. We have seen children taught by their parents to be kind to small creatures. We do not believe that any species is incapable of choice. We came here to give your council a choice. She gestured to the materials her delegation had brought: data drives, visual records, detailed analysis of every Vorthaki operation against every species the Dominion had ever integrated. The kinds of records the High Command had assumed no outside force could ever possess. She told them that humanity had been gathering this information for over 100 years. She told them that everything the Dominion had done in secret was now known. She told them that the rest of the galaxy did not yet have this information, but that humanity was prepared to release it if the Dominion forced the issue. The 14 elders shifted in their seats. This was a different kind of weapon. It was not a weapon they had armor against. The Dominion's power had always rested on a careful management of what other species knew about us, what they feared, what they believed they could expect. If all of that was about to be revealed, the foundations of our rule across 4,000 worlds would crumble in the span of weeks. Vrothan rose slowly from his bench. He walked down the steps to stand on the floor of the chamber, facing the delegation directly. He was a tall Vorthaki, even by our standards, and he loomed over Yuki, who came up only to his armored midsection. She did not flinch. She did not step back. She looked up at him with the same steady eyes I had seen on Lillian Court, the woman who had asked us if we were certain. He asked her what humanity wanted from him. She said 3 things. First, that the Dominion announce, publicly and to all of its client worlds, that the era of forced integration was ending, that any world that wished to leave the Dominion would be allowed to do so without retaliation, that those that wished to stay could do so under new terms negotiated freely. Second, that the Dominion's military be reduced to a defensive posture, no expansionist fleets, no exploration vessels carrying weapons capable of more than self-defense. The Dominion would remain a power in its core territory, but it would not project force beyond it. Third, that the records of what had happened at Lagos and at Vorthak Prime, and in every Vorthaki operation against every species that had ever been touched, would be made public within the Dominion itself. That Vorthaki children would learn what their ancestors had done, that the truth would not be hidden from those who came after. She finished, she bowed slightly, she stepped back. Vrothan stared at her for a very long time. The chamber was so quiet I could hear the slow breathing of the elders on the high benches. He asked her what would happen if the Dominion refused. She said, then we will release the records ourselves to every client world and every neighboring power. The Dominion will fall not by our hand, but by the choices of those who learn what was done to them. We will not lift a finger against you. We will simply tell the truth. The truth will do the rest. Vrothan asked her what would happen if the Dominion attempted to attack Earth again. She said, we have prepared for that. We do not wish it. We would rather you choose the path of change. But if you choose the path of force, you will find that what you experienced above Earth was the gentlest response we are capable of. We did not show you our teeth. We only showed you that we have teeth. There is much more we have not shown. Her voice did not change. She did not threaten. She simply stated a fact the way one might describe the weather. And because she did not raise her voice, because she did not seek to intimidate, the words landed with a weight that no shouting could have produced. The elders on the high benches understood. They had been listening to her for over an hour. They had seen the records. They had felt the truth in her quiet voice. Vrothan returned to his bench. He spoke briefly with the other elders. The council deliberated for less than 10 minutes. They emerged with their decision. Speaker Vrothan rose and addressed the chamber. He said that the High Command would accept the terms, all 3 of them. He said that the announcement to the client worlds would be made within the day. He said that the military reduction would begin immediately. He said that the records would be open to the Vorthaki public, starting with the Lagos incident and working backward through every operation of the past 3,000 years. He paused. He looked down at Yuki Tanaka. He said, we are not doing this because you have asked. We are doing this because we have realized in this past hour that the Dominion as we have known it is already gone. It died above your world when we discovered that we did not understand what we were dealing with. The Dominion that comes next will be different. It will have to be different. Whether it is better will depend on us. Yuki bowed. She said that is all anyone can ever say about themselves. We hope the Vorthaki will be better. We hope to be better ourselves. We will be watching. The meeting ended. The human delegation rose. The escort returned. We were brought back to the human vessel without incident. As I walked through the corridors of the council building for the last time, I felt the eyes of my people on me. Some looked at me with hatred. Some looked at me with confusion. Some looked at me with something that might have been curiosity or perhaps even respect. I did not know what would happen to me. I had abandoned my post. I had returned with the enemy. By every traditional standard of Vorthaki law, I was a traitor. But the traditional standards were changing, even as I walked, and by the time the human vessel lifted off from Vorthak Prime, with me aboard it, no one had moved to stop us. The High Command had let me go. They had perhaps decided that I was more useful free as a voice in the wider galaxy than I would have been imprisoned at home. Or perhaps they had simply decided that they had bigger problems to deal with than one-third-rank scholar who had seen too much. We returned to Earth. The journey was quiet. Yuki and Edward and I sat for many hours in the observation lounge of the vessel, watching the stars pass by, talking about small things and large things in equal measure. They told me about their families. I told them about mine. They told me what they hoped the galaxy might look like in 100 years. I told them what I feared it might look like instead. We did not always agree. But the disagreement was the kind that happened between friends, not between enemies. When we arrived at Earth, Lillian Court was waiting for us at the spaceport in a place called Geneva. She had come personally to greet us. She shook my hand with the same firm grip Yuki had used. She thanked me. She said that humanity owed me a debt it would never be able to repay. I told her that I owed her a debt also, that she had given me a chance to become something better than what I had been, that she had treated me, when I did not deserve it, with the kind of mercy I had spent my whole life thinking was a weakness. She smiled. The smile reached her eyes this time. The tiredness was still there, but there was something else now too, something that looked perhaps like the beginning of peace. That was 10 of my years ago. I am writing this now from a small university office in a place called Kyoto. It is autumn here. The leaves on the trees outside my window have turned red and gold and orange, in patterns that no Vorthaki artist could ever reproduce. The air is cool and smells of something sweet that the humans call cinnamon. I have grown to love that smell. I teach now. I teach humans about Vorthaki history, about Vorthaki culture, about everything I learned in my long centuries of service. My students are kind to me. They ask difficult questions. They are not afraid to challenge me when they think I am wrong, which I often am. I have learned more from teaching them than I ever did from being a scholar in the Dominion. The galaxy has changed since the events I have described. The Vorthaki Dominion no longer exists in the form it once did. The client worlds were given their choice, and most of them chose to leave. Some chose to stay on new terms. The records were released as promised, and the histories of every species we had touched are now being rewritten by those species themselves. There has been pain in that process. There has been anger. There has been demand for accountability that the Dominion has had to face. But there has not been war, not the kind that was feared, not the kind that would have come if humanity had not intervened. Earth is left alone. The galaxy has come to an unspoken understanding about that. There are diplomatic missions to and from Earth. There is trade. There are scholars from many worlds now studying alongside humans in their universities. But no one comes to Earth with weapons drawn. No one threatens. No one tests the limits. The humans have not forgotten what they did. They will not forget. They build memorials for the lost of every species. They teach their children, every generation, about the events of those few terrible days. They do not teach it as a victory. They teach it as a tragedy. They teach it as a thing they hope to never have to do again. I have come to understand, finally, what they meant when they said they feared war. They did not fear it because they were weak. They feared it because they knew themselves. They knew what they could become if they let themselves. They knew that the line between a civilized species and one that destroys without mercy was thinner than anyone wanted to admit, and that they walked on the right side of that line only because they had chosen to, every single day, for generations. When the Vorthaki came to take their world, they had to choose again, and they chose to step across the line briefly to do what had to be done. And then they chose to step back. And then they chose, every day since, to remember the cost of having had to choose at all. That is the secret. That is the thing my people did not understand when they came to Earth, and that I think the galaxy is still slowly learning. The strongest species in any system is not the one with the most weapons. It is the one that has the most weapons and chooses, voluntarily, freely, against every temptation, to keep them in their sheaths. I have one regret, only one. I wish I had spoken louder sooner. I wish I had been brave enough to send my reports up the chain even when I knew they would be ignored. I wish I had refused to follow Kazalter into that final approach. I wish I had done something, anything, that might have stopped what happened above Earth. I cannot change that now. None of us can. The dead of Lagos cannot be brought back. The dead of the flagship cannot be brought back. The damage that was done in those few hours will echo for centuries in both directions. But I can teach. I can write. I can remember. I can make sure that when the next species rises, somewhere in the galaxy, and looks upon a world that seems soft and primitive and afraid of its own shadow, someone will be there to tell them the story of what happened above Earth. To tell them that the appearance of fear is not always what it seems. To tell them that the chains a species places on itself are sometimes the only thing standing between civilization and ruin. I sit at my desk now. The autumn light comes through the window. A small bell rings somewhere in the distance, marking the changing of a class. I will go and teach soon. I have students waiting. But before I go, I want to record one last thing. One last entry in this long account that I have been writing in pieces for 10 years now. The woman with the tired eyes, Lillian Court, passed away 2 years ago. She was very old by human standards, and the strain of those days had not been kind to her. I attended her ceremony. I stood among many thousands of humans who had come to honor her. I listened to her family speak about her, about who she had been before the events that had defined her place in history. They spoke of a grandmother who baked breads and told stories. They spoke of a leader who had spent her last years working tirelessly for peace. They spoke of a woman who had carried, until her last breath, the weight of the orders she had given in those terrible days. At the end of the ceremony, her granddaughter, a young woman named Clara, came to find me. She had something she wanted to give me. It was a small folded paper. Lillian had written it herself in the last week of her life. She had asked Clara to give it to me after she was gone. I opened it with shaking hands. It was very short. It said only this: "Vesh, thank you. We were so afraid we would have to become the thing we hated. You helped us remember that we did not have to become it forever, only for a moment, and then we could come home." I have kept that note. It sits on my desk now. In a small frame I made myself. I look at it every day. It is the most precious thing I own. The bell is ringing again. My students are waiting. I will go and teach them about a species called the Vorthaki, who once thought they understood everything about a small blue world, and who learned, too late, that the deepest strength in the universe is not the willingness to act, but the courage to hold back even when acting would be easy. I will teach them, as I always do, about a question asked 3 times by a woman with tired eyes, a question that should have stopped a war before it began. Are you certain? That is the question every species must ask itself every time it stands at the edge of doing something it cannot undo. Are you certain? Are you certain? Are you certain? Because somewhere out there, in the vast quiet of space, another species is watching. And one day, perhaps, they will come to your door and they will give you the same chance my people were given. And you had better know your answer. You had better know it well.